Thank you. Can you hear me, everybody? Good, good. Um, is it 4:30 or should, a little bit late, should I wait?
It's 4:30 by my.
Oh, okay, that clock's, all right, we'll go by your phone. I'd like to call this meeting to order, and I think it just has introduction and comments. I would like to say that I appreciate Dr. Milton's staff accommodating two things that I requested. Could we get some people out of the hall, and we could accommodate it and put some chairs in here, and also to work on our live streaming. And I do want to say that there'll be a copy. We are not going to give out copies to the presentation today, but there will be copies online in the morning for anybody that wants to see them. Okay? So I wanted to say that. I appreciate the board getting together. This is a very important meeting. We appreciate you guys coming. We have had presentations. I think as a teacher, I call them ground rules, but I'd like to say to the board, I want to hear from everybody. I want everybody's questions to get answered, but I also want us to zero in on the priorities. We were presented with 4 plans a while back before some of you were even on the board. So, Dr. Milton, I appreciate you wanted to catch them up. So part of this is, even though some of you were very interested and you were there, it can be a refresher course for you. I'd like to ask our presenters that as you give us this overview, I would also like to zero in on our priority that I've talked to every board member individually about, that we have a school that we need to find which attendance lines will be for our Pineywood School. So that is truly a priority, and I think Dr. Milton shared that with you, so we'll hear from that. But feel free to hear the questions and not be sure everybody has the time to answer whatever it is they'd like answered. Okay? With that, Dr. Milton, is there anything you'd like to start with? Okay. So, the second, we have Mike Zuba and Patrick Gallagher, and they're going to update us on the progress and processes of growth forecasting and redistricting services, Maloney McBroom. So, I'll turn it to you.
Great, thank you. Share my screen here.
Thanks, Pat. And we're happy to be back here today to be able to give an overview and then really have a good workshop to get your input on the direction we go as we look at some additional alternatives here. So, Pat, on the next slide, please, I think is a good place to get started there. And I think, just to recap this process, I was going back and, we've been working on this project for over a year now. We really started last fall with a lot of work then doing the background, getting into that data collection, talking with the school administrators, analyzing your enrollment data, and reaching out to the county planners to get a good understanding of where economic, housing, and demographic growth is going from a larger picture, and what that then impacts your enrollment projections and your space and your school facilities going forward. And just to touch on it, as we got into this charge of our growth forecasting, we really looked at it, really across the board of all your schools, all your grades, realizing that the main charge was really to create an attendance zone for the Pineywood School, but also in doing that, we felt it was our need to be able to identify what we're seeing as growth and enrollment pressures going forward across the board and capture those in actionable items. And looking at our outreach process, I'll touch on that as well, and that really started in earnest over the summer and has been ongoing in a bit different platform than what we're typically accustomed to, but being able to really connect with the community through our virtual engagement tools and email and the various internet mapping tools that we use in order to be able to get input on this very important process. And then last but not least was the input we received on the scenarios. And I think looking back, we've been fielding that input for over 3 months now on those scenarios, held a lot of different types of venues and used a lot of different vehicles to get that input to really end up where we're at today. With that, I'd like to kind of jump in an overview of why we're all here, and then talk a little bit about some of the information that led us to the scenarios that we had produced. So going back to July, we worked with the board and the community to identify what those primary guiding criteria are for this process. We're well aware of the overcrowding and the enrollment pressures that have been on the Chapin cluster for a number of years now that have led to the enrollment freeze there. So really being able to address that overcrowding, provide capacity, not only for today, but for the future growth. So a lot of times Pat and I are looking ahead and not only, the students that are there today, but how many will be there in 3, 5, and 10 years down the line. Looking at having a way to be able to populate the Piney Woods Elementary School, creating an attendance zone, a catchment area or a boundary around that, which has really been our main focus, and then realizing that has a bit of a domino effect, not only at the elementary level, but as it works its way up through the intermediate, middle school, and high school level, and then balancing enrollment across all grades. Our secondary or our ancillary, criteria, part of our charge is really looking at, geographic proximity. That was something that we heard from as part of our survey that went out in July and August, maintaining those compact neighborhoods, maintaining the existing cluster model and feeder model, as well as with all school redistricting, is really aiming to minimize disruption. One of those underlying components that we've talked about over the last several months is that we're holding harmless and keeping in place all of the programming that has been in place for magnet choice, all of the wonderful offerings that the district provides to the families and students of District 5 are all taken into consideration as part of what we've put together. And we're assuming, as we modeled going forward, that all of those would be there. I know we got a lot of questions on that. I just want to make it clear that we're not showing any plan changes to that other than what we're looking at from an attendance zone standpoint. Here's a map that really is a resultant of the analysis that we did when we looked at 5 years of data, and all of our data points that we're talking about tonight are really referencing that 19 data, and then we project forward from there. Been working through the pandemic and know across the board in all of our clients, whether you're in the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, or in the Southeast, we're all experiencing unusual enrollment years. So really using that as the most accurate representation. We looked at 5 years of data to look at that enrollment change, and this is really kind of focusing in on those hotspots. So areas in green are showing where your overall enrollment has grown over the last 5 years, and areas of pink are showing where you had some loss. Where you do have some mixes of greens and pinks, that's where you have some small clusters of gain and loss. So some, where it ends up in balancing out. But I think what jumps off the map at me is really looking at the Lake Murray Elementary School, where we have some of those darkest greens, some of those largest clusters, then bleeding over into Chapin Elementary School. And then as we look into Dutch Fork, we have some dark areas of pinks and purples, but we also have some areas of green. And then going into Irmo, we have the same pattern there, where we may have some large areas of additional enrollment. They're balanced out by some areas of enrollment loss there. So this is just a really simple way of looking at that enrollment change, and one of the tools we use as we projected enrollment moving forward to look at what that enrollment's going to look like over the next 3, 5, and 10-year horizon. These are the district-wide projections that we had prepared and presented back in at a Board of Trustees meeting. I believe it was sometime around mid-July. And as part of been doing demography for the better part of 20 years, been through housing booms, busts, but never a pandemic, we've learned to be able to, model a low, medium, and high projection model going forward to account for the various conditions that we may face. Overall, we're seeing the medium model being the best fit. That's that darker green line right along the middle of the chart. Overall, your entire student body, we're projecting that to be just below 18,000 students. So we're projecting to see an increase there, but really looking at stability across the board as a whole. One of the things I'd like to point out as part of this is when I look into the individual grade level groupings, the elementary enrollment we're projecting to be fairly steady at about 7,800 students overall over the next decade. The middle school enrollment at about 4,200 students. But where we're seeing that growth driver is really in the high school enrollment overall, where we see that jump from 1,750 upwards to 1,790 or so. That's really with your high school enrollment around the midpoint of the projection horizon, hitting a about 5,900 students to 6,000 students overall for that 10-year period. In order to be able to effectively go through the space planning and be able to bring the what was once the elementary school 13, now Piney Woods Elementary School online, was to be able to look at enrollment targets and figure out exactly where do we need space, where do we have some surplus space, as well as what does that look like as far as your overall utilization going forward. So I think this chart does a good job of being able to identify that. Even with the enrollment freeze, so this is basically your status quo. If you didn't build Piney Woods Elementary School, you would have severe enrollment pressures at Chapin Elementary as well as Lake Murray Elementary, with being well above 100% there, approaching 115 or so percent at Lake Murray overall and over the next 10-year horizon. So we know within those neighborhood areas, that's where we have our greatest growth concentration on a geographic basis, which really informs us when we're doing the attendance zones for Piney Woods. We could hone in on a neighborhood by neighborhood growth and be able to best allocate the students to ensure that the growth pressures are evened out. And the other one that jumped off the table was looking at Irmo Elementary. We do know that it has a neighborhood and choice component there. So it kind of self-balances a little, but that just shows some of the underlying growth there that would occur, but naturally would be balanced out based on that choice component going forward. Taking a peek ahead at the middle and intermediate, overall, we're seeing a lot less, color to this chart, which is a good indication of, being in a good position. Overall, they're all well utilized with nearly all the schools between 75 and 85%. Something that became a big part of our analysis, especially as we were looking at feeders and looking at middle and intermediate, was just this yellow bars in the middle there at Chapin Intermediate, where we're now approaching that 90% threshold. So, not into the red, but into the yellow areas there of some impending enrollment pressures there. And as I mentioned a few slides prior, with the enrollment growth over the next 10 years, really happening at the high school level. So you have some smaller classes matriculating out, moving on, and being replaced by some larger classes that are now rolling up through all your grades in your school system. We see that pressure being really placed on Chapin High School, where starting in the next 5 years, we're going to be approaching that 100% threshold. However, we don't really reach that until the back half of our enrollment projection horizon. So really in the last 3 years of that 10-year window, will you be over that 100%? And that was some of the logic and the reasoning behind when we began looking farther down the road in some of the scenarios that Pat will talk about in a little bit, where we were suggesting some feeder pattern as well as some boundary changes to help be able to mitigate some of that future enrollment pressure that's coming down the pipeline. Just to touch on a little bit of the outreach and how it aligned with our guiding criteria and what we saw, some of the community values. This was a survey that we, just the results that we ran for about a 2-week window back in July. We had a tremendous survey response from the community. Over 7,600 individuals responded to that survey. So kudos to everybody that took the time to get through that 15-minute survey and give us that input. And here is just the overall weighted scoring that we're showing, with really standing out at the top is, looking at the interest of those participants to minimize disruption overall, maintain that geographic distribution, as well as looking to be able to imbalance the enrollment. On the next slide, Pat, is our map viewer, and all of this data and the survey were served up through our online platform. Hopefully everybody at home and all the board members had a chance to be able to get on there, interact on it. That's where we had the district's email address for the redistricting. But this in particular is the map viewer that we've been talking about for the last several months, allowing individuals to be able to go on and either scroll through the scenarios, type in their address, to be able to find out what each of the individual ones may have an impact or may not have an impact, and at what grade level, as well as if you have a mobile device with location services enabled, being able to use that to go right to where you're at and see what that impact would look like. Over the last 3 months, we've had about 3,000 page views. So we know people have been pinging it, people have been using it, and I know from the input that we've received via the emails and the questions, people have been actively involved in it. So I think it's been a great tool so far to date to be able to get that information out there. Any new scenarios that we create going forward from the input we get at tonight's meeting will be housed up there as well to be able to get input in a similar fashion and be able to inform and educate the community in a similar fashion that we've done in the past. With
Thanks,
that,
Mike.
I'll transition over to Pat if you want to recap the scenarios and get into the next part.
Sure. So I'll give a brief overview of the 4 initial scenarios that we published back in the fall that have been up on our web viewer since October, and I'm happy to go into any of these in greater detail once we finish the presentation. So starting with scenario 1, scenario 1 was really focused on minimizing disruption and focusing really on the Chapin cluster. We eliminated the split feeder pattern to address some of the enrollment pressures at the high school level, as well as filling out Piney Woods as a pre-K to 4 school. This scenario did a good job of balancing enrollment at the elementary level while also moving a relatively few number of students. However, it did not address overcrowding at Chapin High School to a level that would allow it to relieve those enrollment pressures for the full 10 years. And it also had a very small area that we moved at the high school level, and there were concerns about the neighborhood that we moved. Has a very strong historic ties to Chapin High School. Scenario 2 is similar to scenario 1 in that it was focused on minimizing disruption. However, it did try to make up for the key flaw in scenario 1, which was the overcrowding at Chapin High School. Another unique thing for scenario 2 was that we shifted Piney Woods to be a pre-K through 5 school. This allows us to shrink the attendance zone by adding 5th grade in, reducing redistricting impacts in the Chapin cluster, while also giving us a little more flexibility at Chapin Intermediate School. Some of the pros of this scenario is that we were able to balance enrollment across all grade groupings, including at the high school. We proposed an approach called phasing in that we've done with several districts before. As Mike had mentioned, high school overcrowding is not something that we see as needing to be implemented next year, but something that you may need to consider in the future as enrollment pressures warrant. And that phase-in approach basically would allow you to implement that at some point in the future when enrollment pressures warrant at Chapin High School. And we divided that up into 2 separate areas. You can move one area first, and then should it not result in enough reduction in enrollment pressures, you can move a second area. However, this would have much greater redistricting impacts at the high school level and would also result in a split feeder pattern at the high school level, moving some areas that were historically within Chapin High School. Scenario 3 really takes a different approach where rather than minimizing disruption, we're seeking to balance and really optimize enrollment across all of our elementary schools. So we're really taking a comprehensive look at every school within the district. And this also uses a pre-K-5 model at Piney Woods. Some of the pros of this concept or scenario is that we were able to really balance enrollment across the board, really ensuring efficient use of every building. We kept to the direct feeder pattern by moving all of the Chapin cluster schools to a pre-K-5 model. That allows us to shrink those attendance zones again and makes the feeder pattern work. However, that also results in an inefficient use of Chapin Intermediate School since it would only house 6th grade. This option would also produce overcrowding at Dutch Fork Middle School, so rather than really solving the problem, we're just shifting the problem from one cluster to another. This also has the most significant redistricting impacts, and again, we know the community really weighted that as a top consideration for them. This also has what we call pocket redistricting, where we move a lot of small neighborhoods as opposed to larger areas, and that's often it makes those areas have more impactful change because students will be moving with fewer peers than if we move a larger area. Scenario 4 is really our balanced approach, where we really seek to balance the disruption from scenario 1 and 2 with the optimized enrollment from scenario 3. Again, we do a pre-K-5 model at Piney Woods, and Some of the pros is that, again, we were able to balance enrollment across all grade groupings. One of the ways we did that is by deviating from your feeder pattern, again, using that phased-in model. That'll allow you to make those changes at the middle school and high school level at some point in the future when you need them. Some of the cons, this does result in some moderate redistricting impacts, more than scenario 1 and 2, particularly at the upper grades, but less than scenario 3. Again, we would move some smaller neighborhoods, what we call the pocket redistricting, and we would deviate from that historic feeder pattern. And again, I'm happy to go over any of these in detail and bring up our interactive map if you have any specific questions, but just wanted to give a brief recap before we get into some of the follow-up scenarios that we've been working on over the last few weeks. We know back at your December meeting, you have approved a contract amendment for us to look at an additional option in addition to the 5th option from our original contract. And we really wanted to just present some initial ideas to you and get some feedback so that we can kind of get a good direction as we develop those final 2 scenarios. And really our focus shifting to implementing the attendance zone for Piney Woods for the 2021 and 22 school year. So the ideas that we'll float tonight are really focused on our short-term priorities and no immediate changes to the intermediate, middle, or high school boundaries. So today's objectives for our presentation is we wanted to present our initial findings and then really hear your thoughts and ideas and guidance on how we approach those final 2 scenarios, particularly around grade configuration at Piney Woods. Is it a pre-K4 or a pre-K5 building, as well as the approach to populating Piney Woods. And I'll go over three of our different approaches over the next couple of slides. So just before we get into some of our ideas, I just wanted to start with the initial elementary attendance zones, with the Chapin cluster here being in the western end of the district, Lake Murray being this darker blue kind of slate color, and Chapin being this lighter blue color, and then Piney Woods being located just to the west of Chapin. One of the notable things about the Chapin cluster is you'll notice that the attendance zones are quite a bit larger than the elementary attendance zones in the Dutch Fork and Irmo cluster. And so as we're developing the different scenarios, that proximity is definitely one of the considerations we want to take into account. Piney Woods and Chapin are also somewhat close to one another, about 2 miles as the crow flies, although that ends up being a little bit longer of a drive due to the impact of the lake. So honing in on the Chapin cluster elementary schools, this is really where we'll focus our efforts because this is the area that's most impacted by the Piney Woods attendance zone. And we wanted to give you a little bit of insight into our approach as we develop our different scenarios. So shown on this map is what we call our planning blocks. They're each highlighted in this dark black line. And essentially, this is our approach to creating, this was the approach we took to creating the initial scenarios, and this is the approach that we'll use to create the follow-up scenarios as well. So these planning blocks essentially represent neighborhoods within the district and really form the building blocks for our different scenarios. We try to use natural boundaries, major roadways, areas where there's vacant land, which kind of form your natural neighborhood boundaries. And this helps us ensure that we're keeping neighborhoods together to the greatest extent that we can, although we can also subdivide these planning blocks further as we're refining an option. So this map now has these numbers populated. This is the K4 enrollment within each of these different planning blocks. And this includes all K4 students who live within the Chapin cluster. Some of these students attend a school outside of the Chapin cluster, whether it's through the enrollment freeze or through your choice in magnet programs, but felt that it was, for the purpose of the exercise, kind of helpful to show where your densest neighborhoods are. In some instances, for example, the northern end of Lake Murray, we have a pretty large planning block, but we only have about 50 K4 students. Compare that to this neighborhood to the east of Lake Murray, very small planning block, but we have over 150 K4 students. So this impacts, really the process for us when we're trying to determine which areas to move. It's proximity as well as the population within each planning block to make sure that we're, in the case of the Chapin cluster, reducing overcrowding at Lake Murray and Chapin Elementary School while also populating Piney Woods. One thing to also note is the difference between Chapin Elementary and Lake Murray. We have almost over 1,200 students, K-4 students, who reside within planning blocks in the Lake Murray attendance zone compared to just under 700 in the Chapin attendance zone. And so over the last several years, Chapin's been really a relief valve through the enrollment freeze to help address some of those enrollment pressures at Lake Murray. One of the challenges is how do we now reallocate these blocks between the three schools as opposed to the two? We also want to continue to look at options K-5 as well, and we really would look forward to your guidance in terms of whether this is something that the board is wanting us to explore further. Looking at K-5 enrollment, particularly for Piney Woods, so you'll notice the numbers went up for all of the planning blocks. Again, our densest neighborhoods tend to be closer to the lake, whereas some of the neighborhoods further to the north, we have a smaller population.
And Pat, if I may, just on that slide too, just to talk about the differences. So as you can see, that enrollment jump by just adding that one grade in each of the planning blocks does have an impact on disruption. So when you go from a K-4 to a K-5, by adding that additional section in, you're now able to get more students within a smaller geographic area, which, as Pat has been talking about, there's a little bit of a leapfrogging from Lake Murray over into Chapin. You can have a less impactful option because you're just capturing a greater number of students in closer proximity than having to sort of reach out a little farther to be able to capture that number of students. So keep that in mind as we walk our way through some of these options because it does have a big bearing on it, but we want to make sure that it's something educationally as well that you feel strongly about to be able to either go in a K-4 or a K-5 direction on what works best from the pedagogy of the school.
Thanks, Mike. All right, so now I'll get into some initial ideas that we want to present tonight, really as discussion starters to really start to hone in on how we want to approach these final these two additional scenarios. The first is to shift students only into the new Piney Woods, so moving areas from Lake Murray and Chapin into Piney Woods. The second is focused on an even split, really dividing those planning blocks up so that we have about equal enrollment between the three elementary schools. And then the third option adds fifth grade into Piney Woods, allowing us to shrink that attendance zone, as Mike had mentioned. The initial ideas 1 and 2, those both assume a pre-K to 4 model. And so we're happy to take a deeper dive on any of these based on your guidance. All right, so this option is looking at shifting only areas into Piney Woods Elementary School. So we're not shifting any areas from Lake Murray to Chapin. We're only moving areas from Lake Murray and Chapin into the new Piney Woods. One of the challenges with this is that Piney Woods obviously being much closer to Chapin. So we're moving the neighborhoods in Chapin that are on the western edge of that district, but we're also trying to grab a significant area of Lake Murray because we know that there's a larger population of elementary students that live within those planning blocks. So we're grabbing the northern end of Lake Murray, really focusing on those areas that are north of Interstate 26. So this ends up getting us to about just under 600 K-4 students at Piney Woods. One of the challenges with this is that we end up underusing Chapin, which would have under 400 students, and we still have a much larger student body at Lake Murray. So we're really not achieving that balance across all of the schools. And it just makes it a challenge just given the distance between Lake Murray and Piney Woods to move many more areas. So this is the second idea, and this is focused more on an even split. So we basically took the three elementary schools within the Chapin cluster and tried to divide the K-4 enrollment evenly between the three buildings, trying to keep proximity to the greatest extent that we can. You'll notice that this does have what we call a double shift. So we're moving primarily areas from Chapin into the new Piney Woods. We are moving a small area of Lake Murray up here north of I-26 into Piney Woods as well. And then to kind of counterbalance that, we're moving areas of Lake Murray into Chapin as well. And so that helps balance out enrollment across the board. All three buildings would be roughly between 600 and 650 students. And the third idea that will float out for discussion is converting Piney Woods to a pre-K-5 school. So what you'll notice is that in these pink areas, which we assigned to Piney Woods in this idea, the numbers increase because we're adding 5th grade in. That allows us to shift a smaller area. So one of the things you'll notice, if I go back to the previous map, we're moving some neighborhoods that are right next to Chapin Elementary School into Piney Woods in order to get that enrollment balance. By adding 5th grade, we're able to keep those neighborhoods in Chapin Elementary School, have some better proximity. Similar to the previous option, we also have what we call that double shift, where we're moving or populating Piney Woods primarily from the current Chapin Elementary, and then we're moving areas of Lake Murray into Chapin to help balance enrollment across the board. And I'm happy to, again, bring up any of these on a map if you're interested in any specific neighborhoods. And again, these are just kind of discussion starters. These can be fine-tuned if you think that any of these are worth exploring further. These obviously aren't the final boundaries. We would take a deeper dive and take a look at that for you. So just to go over really our key findings, it's going to be difficult to shift a large number of students from Lake Murray into Piney Woods due to the sheer distance and Chapin being much closer. So we are recommending a double shift where we're shifting students from Chapin into Piney Woods. We think we can also shift some students from Lake Murray into Piney Woods, but not enough to relieve those enrollment pressures. And the double shift would mean, in addition to that, also shifting areas of Lake Murray into Chapin. Adding 5th grade into Piney Woods would also result in smaller attendance areas, which would help lessen disruption and lessen shifting, while also helping manage any future enrollment pressure at Chapin Intermediate School. But as Mike had mentioned, also taking the educational considerations into account, we're really looking at this purely from an enrollment and capacity standpoint, but obviously have to ensure that it aligns with your educational objectives as well. And so just to conclude on some of the discussion items is really, looking for your input tonight on, what types of things should we focus on for these two additional scenarios, particularly around grade configuration at Piney Woods. Is the school a pre-K4 or is pre-K5 something that still is on the table that you'd like us to explore for the attendance zones, as well as the approach to populating Piney Woods? We went over the three today, and they were also similar approaches that we had presented in our initial redistricting scenarios as well.
Mm-hmm. And then Pat, just to wrap it up, I know some of the ones that in our scenarios 1 to 4 we had continued some of those redistricting options up through the grade levels. Any one of those can just be further looked at from the elementary school, the populating of Piney Woods standpoint as well, and be on the table for discussion and subsequent adjustments as part of that. So with that, I'd like to, I think we've talked for about a half hour, and we're eager to hear from the Board of Trustees and any questions, any thoughts, any input you have on the process.
Thank you very much. I brought in, I'm glad that Mr. White's up there with us virtually. Because he and I are the only ones that remember it, but we had a McKibben study that, and I asked Mr. White, even though this was done a while back, it was before we built that school, but it was designed for attendance area in that area out in Amos Ferry. So it seems like I thought I'd just show this also to the board and share one with you. I think we can email this to you. Can't we get them a copy of that? I just want this to be there. And this may look just like your map. I was listening to you and making my notes, so I didn't look, but I'm going to give this to the board just to say he looked at this same problem, so I thought it might be really good to put that together with what his thoughts were and your thoughts. With that, though, I would like to start questions from the board, and we'll, as I said, we'll just be sure everybody has time, and we watch the time as each one asks. Ms. Huddle?
Can you tell us what capacity numbers you used for Chapin, Lake Murray, and Piney Woods?
Yes. Give me 1 second to open that file up. Pat, do you have it open yet?
I do. Yep. So,
All right.
Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about
Yep.
kind of our methodology for the enrollment targets before I get into the
I will.
numbers?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So one of the key documents we referenced and then later vetted with district administration was for looking at the established enrollments from a report from the Southern Management Group. I believe it was from a few years ago, where looking at the square feet and the capacity, that was the baseline number. For Piney Woods, we started with the design capacity as the baseline number. What we do is we establish an enrollment target based on that. We never do our planning around the maximum capacity, especially when you do have a attendance zone or a neighborhood component. We know that there needs to be some buffer or headroom space there. So what we do is we apply this efficiency factor where, for the elementary schools, we're looking at roughly 90% for that number. So looking at the overall capacity and then establishing an enrollment target of 90% of that, that allows for some fluctuations in class sizes, and it really mimics what occurs naturally. As we look into the middle school and high school level, we know there that capacity is largely driven by scheduling of space, use of space within the buildings, and really how you deliver your education. So for those individual schools, we took that same capacity number from that study and used 75 to 85% of that to account for those scheduling factors. So really reduce that level to a little bit greater degree, that enrollment target a little bit more below what you see typically for elementaries, but that allows for, say, in a high school where you're offering different programs and, not every student's going to take advanced courses, but is still in a full-size classroom. It really is able to account for, those various factors. Pat,
Right.
do you want me to pass over to you now to go
Sure,
through?
yeah.
There you go.
So I have our table up. I believe this was from our July presentation. So the capacity column here is from that Southern Management report that Mike had mentioned. So we were using a capacity of 916 for Chapin. Using our 90% efficiency factor, our enrollment target for that was 824 students. Lake Murray, the capacity in that Southern Management Group study was 849 students. Our 90% enrollment target for Lake Murray is 764 students. And then for Piney Woods, we're using that design capacity of 700 students. So our enrollment target, which includes that 90% efficiency factor, is 630. And that includes pre-K for all of these as well.
Ms. Huddle, is that okay? Mr. Lovelace?
My question is for Dr. Melton, one of the questions. My question is for Dr. Melton, for the first one, and I wanted to know, how do you believe that putting the K-5 versus the K-4 would affect student outcomes at any elementary school, not just the one we're talking about?
Yes, sir. Mr. Lovelace, thank you for the question. We all, of course, know that there are some schools, as Mr. Lovelace is describing in School District 5, that are PK through 5, some that are kindergarten through 5th grade, some that are through 4th grade in the Chapin area specifically. If Dr. Harris were at the microphone, he and Ms. Price would tell you that there is a significant need for a 4K addition in the Chapin area. So if we were to have that option at Piney Woods Elementary, that would help us expand our 4-year-old kindergarten offerings to keep children in the community rather than transporting them into other places of programs. So would it affect us instructionally? The instructional program would be the same. It would affect Chapin Elementary, of course. It would affect, Chapin Intermediate. It would affect families that are in the Chapin feeder zone, that some neighbors of some friends maybe go into Chapin Intermediate for the 5th, 6th experience, while others could stay with 5th grade at Piney Woods Elementary that would go to Chapin Intermediate for 6th grade. So there could be some disruption of transitions for those families. If you look at it through an Irmo Dutch Fork lens, of course, they have a unique 1 year of Crossroads. So the Irmo Dutch Fork students already had that transition towards a 6th grade school only at Crossroads Intermediate as a choice, or Irmo Middle, that being choices, and I have to interject, Irmo Middle has 6th grade as choice as well. So it would be consistent with the personality of School District 5 operations to go either direction depending on the will of the board.
Okay, so my question, though, to narrow it down, because that's a broad question, it wasn't fair to catch you like that, but what I'm saying is, okay, is there any effect in the outcomes to wait for a student to go from the 4th grade to go to another school versus the 5th grade to go to another school? Is that what we're talking about, putting a 5th grade in one school? Is there any emotional effect or anything like that it's too early to make them go to a new school, or do they like to stay with their cohort, or that's what I'm getting at.
Yes, sir. I think that is dependent on the family. We have families that are still choosing Crossroads Intermediate as a choice for those students in the Irmo and Dutch Fork areas. We have others that are choosing Irmo Middle School to have that 6th grade experience so that there can be fewer transitions. So that's one of the luxuries of offering choice in the Irmo and Dutch Fork area for either Crossroads or Irmo Middle, and of course they're open to choice system-wide. So that would offer an additional lens for the Chapin community that they may have that they don't currently have if they don't choose to leave the Chapin community. It does create transitional issues. It would create some disruptions at family schedule of how they're going to coordinate drop-offs at different schools. But I think it depends on the wishes of the family, the needs of the student, and how might we make sure that we prepare those transitions successfully. Crossroads, I think we all would agree, has proven that they can make that a successful model for 1 year transition. And depending on how Piney Woods Elementary is constructed by or configured by the will of the board, we certainly would commit to make sure that any family that's going through that, whether they have more changes or not, that we would help with that preparation for movement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Gardner?
So I have a question about these numbers are based on current enrollment, but I know we've talked about projected increases in enrollment. I know from my own, I live in one of these attendance school zones, and I know that there are lots and lots of houses going in some areas, but not so much in others. Have you thought about, instead of doing a clean sweep of, 600, 600, 600 in each school, have you looked at the numbers of where you expect the growth to be and then make those schools just a little bit smaller? Because we know that there's a lot of growth in the Piney Woods area and in the Chapin Elementary School area, but not so much in the very far east part of our school district.
That's a great question. And as we kind of move these from the initial ideas into our final 2 scenarios, that's definitely something we'll take into consideration. We'll be developing projections for those scenarios to account for that future growth. And as you had mentioned, that's the approach we'll take as we're developing those final two options, is making sure that we're leaving that space in those schools that do have the fastest growing neighborhoods. So yes, that'll be something we take into consideration.
Yeah, and that's something that we've been looking at the whole time. So as I talked about, I had that little bit of a hotspot map up, and I showed that future utilization curve where we saw where pressures were coming down the road. We have that at the geographic level where we're seeing turnover of students. We also have the data on housing starts and new housing developments. So that's all getting factored in. As Pat and I look at this, we're trying to be able to strike a balance between having efficient and effective operation today, as well as having boundaries that withstand the test of time down the road. So even though some of the scenarios are showing slightly below where that enrollment target is, we're keeping a mindful eye that some areas are growing. We're going to see future growth that we don't want to have pressures that pop up 5, 6, 7 years from now as part of this process.
And just to add one more thing to that, we also have 3 buildings that are different sizes as well. And so the even split, for example, if you're doing 650 in each building, may leave more space in one rather than the other. So, you know, if an even split is something you're interested in exploring, maybe that's something we account for the size of the building as we're doing that split. So the bigger schools get larger areas, and the smaller schools get smaller areas.
Yeah, and one last thing before we move on. I know it's part of our prior slide decks. I think going back to the, I think it was the mid-October projections for each of those scenarios, we did that look ahead of what the enrollment would look like under each of the elementary schools, as well as then rolling up through the various grade levels. And as Pat and I were working through this, we would make some boundary changes, look at certain areas, and saw whether or not the movement between different districts of those areas pushed enrollment over the capacity. Did it do enough to get to that efficient operation? So that's something that we've been including in our analysis through our software as we've gone through this to date, and would do it in the 2 new scenarios.
Thank you. Mr. Hogan.
For a question from McLennan Broom, with the 3 scenarios, will these be available on the interactive website for families to be able to check their addresses and see how it impacts them?
I think tomorrow morning, right?
Okay.
Aaron Strange told me that we were not giving these out here, but we would have them on the internet by in the morning.
The packets, I'm referring to the interactive website that McLennan Broom provided the district.
Yes, sir. So I'd like to ask Mr. Gallagher or Mr. Zuba to weigh in on that. Is Ms. Hammond's correct? The presentation itself will be posted. As far as access through the interactive map, Mr. Zuba, how quickly might the interactive map be updated so that families who have already participated with inserting their address to see how the scenarios would affect them, that they could go in and use this? And I'd like to pause to commend this team. In less than a calendar month of operational work, of course, with 2 holidays inserted, this team is very quickly creating these scenarios to make sure that they were responsive to the action of the board from the December meeting. So I'd like to make sure that I went on record publicly so that Mike and Patrick Cura say that they have worked very quickly to create this for consideration of the board. But Mr. Zuba, as far as the interactive map update, how quickly might that be?
Yeah, I think today, as Pat mentioned, these are just ideas. So we're going to get input and listen to everything from the board today. Then we're going to go back and make some adjustments so these boundaries are a little bit more refined. And then when we're ready to come back and share with the board, we'll have it ready to go there. So at that meeting, the public will be able to follow along from home and be able to see the interactive mapping when we're bringing it back out for the board's consideration. So I'm looking at, depending on where we end up tonight with input, within a few weeks, being able to have better polished, more polished scenarios. I guess they would be 5 and 6, Pat, out there for the board's consideration and the public viewing.
Ms. Hammond, if I may add for clarification and the conceptual connecting the dots, so to speak, in regards to Mr. Hogan's question, we wanted to make sure that the board saw these scenarios first, and we know with any updates for the interactive map, that could lead to misunderstandings and false impressions of this process. So having it in a presentation such as you see tonight, using the feedback of the board, then for our Mullen Broom company to then go in and make any revisions before we take it to an interactive map. We know with every update on that interactive map, families can become confused of, have I done the most recent or have I done one that's out of date? So out of our commitment to try to keep this as fluid as possible, but also as reliable that families could see with accurate information, we've not been too aggressive to get that out there. Instead, let the board weigh in on what the feedback would be that you all would offer to us.
Ms. Blackburn-Hines?
I have so many questions, but I'm gonna
One now.
just one right now, and I'm actually gonna ask, following up on what Mr. Lovelace was asking about the 4th grade and the pre-K through 5th grade. And it's really kind of geared towards the pre-K section, because I noticed on these maps, it says that it's K through 4, and I believe Chapin Elementary has a 4K, if that's correct. Are those 4K numbers included in the numbers that are shown in these plans?
I asked Mr. Zuber and Mr. Gallagher to weigh in on that. I would say there's also some special education programming
Okay.
at Chapin Elementary, which of course is included as well.
Okay.
But we know that special education programming may be moved depending on the assignments of students and the services that we're providing. So although there has been some consistency of where programs are, we have shown that we move programs around to get students closer to their homes where there's available space, but making sure that families feel connected with the community and that students have the connection with their community.
Right.
Mr. Zuba, would you or Mr. Gallagher prefer to add to the answer of that question?
Sure, yeah. So as Mike had mentioned, we're going to be refining and creating those two scenarios based on your input tonight. As part of that, as we're creating that more detailed scenario, we'll make sure we're accounting for pre-K as well as all of the special programs throughout the district. And as we develop projections, we'll make sure that we're accounting for pre-K as well as choice and magnet students as well. The numbers we presented tonight do not show pre-K for the planning blocks, and also don't account for students who may attend a school outside of Lake Murray and Chapin. But in that kind of next round of refinement, we'll make sure that that's accurately accounted for.
So that was my question, was whether or not, when we looked at this, if we could look at it from a K4, pre-K perspective through fourth grade, as opposed to just a K through fourth grade perspective. I mean, it's not that I have a strong opinion. I mean, I just know that there's a big emphasis on pre-K right now. And if we have that availability, I want to know if those numbers significantly impact that Piney Woods section, because Piney Woods has the space to start pre-K out right now. And when you only have one school in the cluster that's in the 5th grade, how does that impact the students at Chapin Elementary School and Lake Murray Elementary School that start at Chapin Intermediate School in the 5th grade versus Piney Woods when their 5th grade students don't start until 6th grade? I know that sounds kind of convoluted, but that was my question, if those numbers could be put into this plan.
It wasn't convoluted at all. Pat and I know exactly what you're asking.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Milton, did you want to say
Yes,
something?
ma'am, and if I could add, Ms. Hammond, our 4-year-old kindergarten program is based upon qualifications. There's testing involved. There are family interviews. There's processes that our staff are doing. So we're not serving 100% of our 4-year-old children.
Okay.
We are serving based upon the number of allocated teachers that we have to serve these programs, and then those programs are placed appropriately. So when it came to the analysis and preparation by Patrick and Mike, it was important for them to understand what our capacity is to offer a 4K program, because this district has shown a commitment to offer supplement to add additional 4-year-old classes in addition to what maybe we'd be required to as far as state funding. So if the board were to have the will to add additional 4K sections to serve the needs so that we could reach a larger percent, that too could become a variable of this process.
Good, thank you. Before I come to Ms. Gardner, Mr. White, is there any question? I was trying to be real fair and go to everybody first. Oh, I can't hear you. Mute, unmute.
Okay. I don't have any questions. The one thing, just an observation, it seems to me, putting aside the 4K question for the second, this last chart on page, I guess it's 24, that shows Piney Woods being set at 552 and the Chapin Elementary and Lake Murray being set at the 700 levels. That just seems to me, that makes a lot of sense, given there's probably more growth coming in the Piney Woods area. It leaves some buffer there, and it leaves maybe the least movement, going forward. Just from everything everybody's saying, that seems to be, to me, an option that has the least disruption and might leave the most flexibility for the future as they build out around Piney Woods, which I think is happening with subdivisions coming in.
Thank you.
It's an observation.
I think Ms.
Go ahead.
Gardner was next, and then Mr.
Yeah,
Hogan. Go
I
ahead.
think, I appreciate us being able to talk about our opinions, because I'm about to give an unsolicited opinion about this whole thing. I have a very strong opinion about 4K, and I think it should be offered in all of our schools. I know right now in Irma, we have lots of choices. There are some that are, programs, some that are fee-based, some that are, we've got Montessori, we've got those for special needs, and I think that the Chapin cluster needs the same options. And so I think, personally, I would love to see the 4K and the 3K and all the other special programs be offered as much as they can be in that area. My own child went to the 4K program, and we had to cross our fingers and hope we got in. And we were blessed to get in because of his special needs that he had. That was a few years ago, but I would hate for anybody not to be able to get in. So I have a very strong opinion about 4K. And then my other opinion, this is an opinion, and this is how I feel. I mean, we should probably discuss this, but I don't like the idea of putting the fifth grade at Piney Woods, because it creates a cohort there that then has to integrate into, quite a few number of students that have already been together for a year, and I feel it might be hard on those students. And you're right, it is about choice, but if we make it, if we make that a fifth grade program, maybe we're not offering choice. Maybe we could offer choice to go to Chapin Intermediate, but is that too much to ask? And it would be disruptive every year. The fifth grade teachers, based on what the students wanted to do, would have to jump from school to school. So I don't know, my own opinion would be to leave it out, but still keep Piney Woods small for the growth, and then offer more pre-K. That's my opinion.
Mr. Hogan, do you have one before?
Yeah, question for Dr. Melton.
Just gonna go-
Kind of to piggyback on Ms. Gardner, would the option be to have 4K until development comes to that area where we need to utilize the entire school, and then make a decision as a district whether to continue the 4K there or not?
We are awaiting the will of the board, honestly. When it comes to the identification of 4-year-old students, we're entering into that window now. In fact, Dr. Harris has updated me this week about our communication efforts to get the message out as to how and when we're going to test for our incoming 4-year-old students. So this is part of the calendar where we are currently. We have been hesitant not to communicate where 4K programs are going to be placed, because we want to make sure that the programs are assigned where the need is warranted. And of course, wherever you place programs, you have additional, what we would refer to as wraparound services. Students who are in 4K may be more likely to qualify for speech and language development. They may be more likely to qualify for some other services. So some of the things that Ms. Gardner has described of where programs are placed and how they're placed, we're trying to provide that proximity that you heard her describe, but it doesn't mean that a student's going to be in their neighborhood or even in their assigned cluster where they could be easily routed unless they participate with choice. So it would help us as an administration to have some of this information. And of course, Ms. Hammond and the officers can tell you all the agenda for the next meeting has not been developed at this point. So if the board were to decide, if the officers were to place this on the agenda for the January meeting, and if you all were to decide to take action, that's going to help us communicate where we can expect 4K. If there is a 4K expansion that Ms. Gardner has shared her opinion about this evening, that, of course, would affect our budgeting process that's going to start shortly thereafter, so that we can make sure we have the appropriate number of staff employed and then the appropriate number of students that have been assigned, assuming the need is there.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Blackburn Hines?
Just real fast, I agree with Ms. Gardner's opinion on the 4K. I think that's really important. And I also agree with the hesitation to just have fifth grade at Piney Woods. It's not that I don't like fifth grade in an elementary school, but if we're going to do that, I like fifth grade in all of the elementary schools in that cluster, so that you're not separating who's going to be in the school in the sixth grade, which is kind of what I was trying to say in a roundabout way earlier. So just because for discussion purposes, I'm throwing that in. But back to these maps, to these new plans. So I'm looking at it, and when you compare these to the 4 plans that were originally put forth back in July, when you look at that top section, I don't know if you can see me, but like that top pink section for Piney Woods, where we're looking at, near where Chapin Middle School, is,
Does it have a number?
67.
Sorry,
She's talking about 67, and then
Okay, thank you.
that's the number of students, but you can identify
where, yeah,
it
where,
by the
well,
60.
well, I guess, yeah. Depends on the page. One says 51 students, one says 67 students. But that area of the map is what I'm really looking at, because that's a big difference between those first four maps, if I'm not mistaken. And when I look at that, just because I live in the area and I think about where Chapin Middle School is and driving all the way to Amex Ferry to go to school, what's that rationale right there? I know that, I mean, is it just because we asked for two different plans and it's just totally different? Or, I mean, my concern is those students that are at that top part by where Chapin Middle School is off of Broad River, like that's a pretty far distance to go all the way down to Amex Ferry and then come back up. Like if you have a parent taking a student to school or a school bus coming, you're coming back up all the way through town in that area. So that's my concern, and I don't know what that rationale was with that little area.
Ms. Blackburn-Hearns, can I ask for clarification, since Mr. Zuba and Mr. Gallagher are with us virtually? If I go to slide 21 that's numbered in the bottom right, can you make sure we're all looking at the same one together so that when the response is offered as to, I assure you it wasn't happenstance, there was some science involved with how this idea was shared. So before they focus in on a particular slide, can you make sure that we're all looking at the same one together?
Right. So if you went to slide 22 or 23 or 24, they're all kind of very similar. You're talking about a difference of like maybe 16 students. But that top area, like when you have it up there right there, it says 51. Like that little area up there that is going towards Piney Woods, to me, that's so far away from where Piney Wood is versus Lake Murray or, I mean,
And flow of traffic.
in the flow of traffic. So, and I'm sure that there is science. I'm just curious as to what it is
Sure.
and what that justification is.
Mr. Zuber, Mr. Gallagher, who would prefer answering that one?
So I could start, and Mike, you can chime in. So that's a great question, and this is the types of challenges that Mike and I have to grapple with when we do this for any of our clients. It's that trade-off between hitting that enrollment sweet spot and proximity. In this instance, and I think you all can see my screen here, this neighborhood in the northern end of Piney Woods is the one that we're talking about, was moving areas directly from Lake Murray into the new Piney Woods. And the area there north of I-26 being somewhat close, obviously not very close, but out of all of the neighborhoods in Lake Murray, among the closest to get to Piney Woods was really the rationale for it. Unfortunately, you're right, it is very far away, and that's going to be one of the pieces we'll have to grapple with of, do you do some give and take where maybe you keep this neighborhood in a certain school, but then that results in lower enrollment at Piney Woods, so it's all kind of part of that give and take. But it wasn't arbitrary. It was kind of a decision we made. It was also part of that rationale was to give you something different to look at so that we weren't just rehashing the four scenarios that we had presented previously.
And Pat, I'll be happy to add to it if you could be my hands. I know once I start talking, you'll move that pointer in the right direction too. One of the things we heard was we got a lot of feedback, especially from those families in Chapin Elementary. And as you can look at the map right there, about 1.5 miles or 2 miles as the crow flies between Piney Woods and Chapin. And when Pat and I really dug into the numbers, there's a lot of growth in Lake Murray. So how do we be able to spread out some of that student enrollment pressure without directly impacting those in Chapin? Some of the emails that I went through, what we heard as part of the forums of, from some of those Chapin families about, why are they being moved? And it was really to provide an option where we did not impact that area immediately around the Chapin Elementary School. So it's a more roundabout and a less direct way to try to get there in that enrollment balancing, but obviously it's a little bit more of a reach when you look at that corner of the Lake Murray Elementary District and having them go down to Piney Woods. So it was really, the science, but it was also in response to some of the comments that we heard. Obviously, it not being part of one of our initial scenarios, speaks volumes to did we think it was the best direct route? No, we would have had it in one of our scenarios 1 through 4, but we didn't. But we wanted to include it now just to be able to visualize the impact and see, what really are the realm of possibilities. But through redistricting and my experience, the hardest ones to do are the ones where the new school or the redistricting gets to the edge of your district boundary, because you could really only move one way with the direction of students. And we wanted to put this out there as a way to be able to mitigate that the double shift or the domino or the leapfrog effect, using some redistricting terms there. Hopefully that clarifies it.
Ms. Huddle.
I'd like to build on what Ms. Blackburn-Hines said, as well as what Mr. White said, and just I'll just go ahead and throw out a recommendation of a plan I'd like to see, which is really the one on page 24, but have it only go through 4th grade, because I agree with Ms. Blackburn-Hines. I think that you're going to create some social issues if you've got some kids going through 5th grade. But moving those 67 kids to Chapin Elementary, and it's not going to be 67, then it's going to be, I guess, 51 that you do. But the reason I recommend this is I know it's not balanced. I know it's going to leave Piney Woods empty, but I promise you that's not going to last very long. Anyone who's lived here for 10 or 15 years, close your eyes and think back to Johnson Marina Road 15 years ago, or think back to Old Lexington and Wessinger 10 years ago. What you have is you have a lot of empty land down Amex Ferry Road, and up until recently, you didn't have a single subdivision that wasn't on the lakefront. But once that school went up, you got Long Pine Station. I have a list of about 5 neighborhoods that are in the works down that road. So, and the other thing is, if anyone thinks that they want to travel down that road and come back, try doing it Monday through Friday between 7 and 8 a.m. You will literally spend 20 minutes trying to get through that light at the end of Amex Ferry Road and 76. So I'll just throw that out there. I realize it would leave the school partially empty, but I don't think it's going to stay empty very long.
I'm trying to take turns. Yeah, Mr. Ludleston.
Okay, I agree with Ms. Blackburn-Hines about the pre-K, and I agree with Kathy about the basically you're bucking the trend when you go backward to each way with the traffic. So I would like to see us have a scenario where on page 24 where the number 19 goes to Chapin Elementary School, and the area that's with the 67 students, if it's too much to go to Lake Murray, that we could divide that somehow, and a part of that be included to go to Chapin, and the other half go to Lake Murray. And the reason why is because you just simply can't get out of there in the mornings, and in the afternoons the traffic is just horrendous, and you're not going to be able, with the growth that we're going to have in the Amex Ferry corridor and the church, the St. Peter's Church corridor, that's not even developed at all. You're going to have tremendous growth out there. So you'll be doing this again in 2 years or 3 years. So if we could take where the number 19 is and the number 67 and keep those going, toward the places that where they're going now, it would surely be less disruptive on everybody. And I'm talking about the whole community as far as, I've already had people that live out in the Amex Ferry corridor, and they're putting their houses up for sale. They're moving. They're not gonna, I'm talking about, I know 5 people that have come to me, and these are people with kids, with children. And they're just saying, we can't add another 30 minutes to our travel to get to work in Columbia in the morning. So those two, if we could see a scenario somehow that would take where the 19 is and put that toward Chapin, and the number 67, if we have to divide that to get to get that into Lake Murray, I think that would be more, I think that would be a better solution.
Well,
Blackburn High.
but if you look at, Mr. Lovelace, if you look at the one before, 23, where that's the K4, like what you're suggesting, those numbers are 16 and 51. I mean, that's the same number as if to me, that seems reasonable. We're not increasing the numbers so much more. We're increasing the numbers, 67 students at Chapin Elementary School. So if we were,
I'm worried
I think that
about
makes
the
sense.
bucking the traffic pattern.
no, I'm saying,
Okay.
I'm agreeing with you.
Okay, I'm
I
sorry.
know, it may be shocking, but I'm agreeing with you, that it's the same number, so, I think that's a reasonable request if we're trying to get new lines drawn.
And I do think that you all make a great point about looking ahead. And I think I've heard like 4 of you on that same page, that we have to look at how quickly Piney Woods will be filled up. Ms. Gardner?
Well, and I just wanted to emphasize too that down Wessinger, that's growing the same way as Amex Ferry. So my opinion would be on those 51 students above the I-26 corridor would actually stay in the Lake Murray district, because the flow of traffic, it's very easy to get those 51 students driving down the road to Lake Murray. And they're used to doing it, and it's worked, I think, till now, unless they've told you otherwise. I don't know anybody who lives up there that told me they didn't like driving to Lake Murray. But it would work to put those 51 in Lake Murray and to put, and I'm still on page, whatever, the 23 and 4.
Yeah.
That would help alleviate some of the, it would, because I personally think that when you look at the numbers and the growth, Lake Murray, since it's also a bigger school, I think, than Piney Woods, it should hold more students. And so you're going to want to transfer more there that's going to be more stable there, and then there's going to be growth in the other 2 areas. So that's just a thought. I don't know if anybody agrees or disagrees, but those people have a better, as far as patterns of traffic go, there's just 2 turns and you're down at that school, so.
Mr. Hogan?
And real quick, Ms. Huddle, you had mentioned that you had a list of neighborhoods that are coming. Do we know how many residential permits Lexington County's issued?
Yeah,
Last, say, year? I mean, or whatever parameters you have.
I just asked recently from the county and from the Chapin Sewer, because that whole peninsula is on the Chapin Sewer, so I just asked for the taps and estimated. One thing that is also, there's 2 big plots of land for sale over off St. Peter's Church. One is going to allow 4 per acre. The other's up to 12 per acre. I doubt they'll actually do that. But if you use 4 per acre for each of those, you're looking at 1,135 home sites right now that either already have a tap or where the land is for sale. So that's a lot of home sites. And that still doesn't begin to take up the vacant land around there.
Ms. Hammond, may I ask Mr. Zuba to weigh in on that, because that was part of the process of working with both Lexington County and Richland County. Mr. Zuba, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, Pat, do you want to pop into that? I know when we sat down with the county planners, we identified tracts of land and growth initiatives. We also had from Lexington County, we had future permits, so properties that were approved but not yet built. We weren't able to get that level of detail from Richland County, but they were able to share with us tracts of land that they saw as growth areas. So as we built that into it, we're in 100% agreement on where that growth is likely to occur, and being able to provide that grow up in that buffer area. I think the main thing, and I'm hearing the conversation going there, is that, we're being mindful of that growth and want to reserve the room. It's how best to be able to strike the balance between a well-utilized building today and, basically future-proofing some boundaries down the road. And it sounds like that the conversation on the 4K program there could be a good route to be able to do that as well. Just speaking a little bit more generally and getting back to when Pat and I were sort of back in our virtual offices here working on it, we like to be able to divide up some of that growth potential as well. So as we craft the boundaries, it's just not around existing neighborhoods, but being able to take some tracts of land and be able to ensure that it's not all going to be bore out by one attendance zone going forward. So that's a little technique that we have too, where we begin as we work towards the final boundaries, future-proofing those. So if we have some space and we have some capacity, we're going to carve out boundaries and divide up those tracts of land accordingly.
Any other, is that a good answer? Anybody ready for another question on that same line? Mrs. Blackburn-Hines?
Not on that same line.
Okay. All right, then you want to move to a different question then?
Well, my question is, I guess, is to the board and to Dr. Melton and to the consultants is, I guess, how long does it take to get a finalized plan for us to be able to look at and present to the public? And when are we planning on voting on a reentry plan for elementary schools? Because I know that there is an immediate staffing concern, and we have a board meeting on January 25th. So what's the timeline of all of this? What are we looking?
Are you talking about this study?
Yes, about,
Just getting
about,
Like
to-
when we
like,
would
when are we
actually
gonna
vote?
have, when are we gonna vote? So if we're gonna vote on January 25th, do we have enough time to get this new proposed plan back to us where we can look at it before we sit at a board meeting and vote on it? And when do we need to do that? Because I know we need to staff Piney Woods, and I know that's a pressing concern, so I'm just trying to see where we are as,
All right, and
The board.
Mrs., you have a follow-up with her point, Mr.
Well,
Lovelace?
Yeah, we had, I wanted to see the interactive map put out. If we're going to do, the suggestion that I just made and some other people were, seemed to be, seemed to be acceptable to everybody. I would like to see their interactive map with those changes on it before we put that out, because that's just going to create, a lot more confusion if we put out two interactive maps. And I just thought, that wouldn't be a good idea. But if we could, Mr. Zuba would have to answer if we get the interactive map, when we could do that. And I think we should be ready to go forth at the next board meeting if
they can do that.
we can get that out there.
So,
And
so
that's the
that,
point. So-
I'll make that clear. That's your question, is sort of implementation of this and when we could actually vote on it so that Dr. Melton and her staff can move forward. Dr. Melton, I'll acquiesce to you and to this group whether you can have taken all of these questions and suggestions and listen to us and send us something that we can see. I mean, not another meeting, but we're able to maybe, we still have, am I right, Dr. Melton? Do you tell me till 6:30 or 6? 6.
We've reserved 6:30 with our contracted services, but if you'd like to complete earlier, we can certainly.
Well, I just wanted to be sure that we had enough time
Yes, ma'am.
for them to have it to us by hearing all these suggestions, questions right now. Because ideally, would you like it to be voted on by the next meeting? To be on the agenda? It has to be discussed, but
Yes, ma'am.
need
So
discussion.
if we were to look ahead and to put dates into place, because just a point of clarity, the next regularly scheduled board meeting is the 25th of January. So our process has been, obviously this being a board workshop, when is the board going to bring this back for discussion and/or action? And how might this look differently? If you think back to the October 7th board workshop that we did with Mr. Zuba, Mr. Gallagher, the presentation was pretty consistent with what the board saw on the 7th of October that was represented on that Monday night. So it gave the board the opportunity to mull it over, to do some thought towards it, to be better prepared for that discussion during that board meeting. So in response to Mr. Lovis's question, we've got 4 schools whose staffing plan is going to be affected, Ms. Blackburn-Hines and Ms. Gardner as well. So when it comes to the HR perspective of Dr. Turner and her team, we have delayed staffing conferences with Piney Woods Elementary. We have delayed staffing conferences with Chapin Elementary, with Lake Murray Elementary, and Chapin Intermediate. Because depending on which way the will of the board goes, depending on 5th grade, if the board were to take an action with one scenario, that affects Mr. Davis and his staffing scheduling, certainly affects Mr. Wiseman, our Director of Transportation, and Mr. Biedenbow, of course, with the other operations. So there definitely is an effect. If the next regularly scheduled board meeting, if the officers were to place this for action, because it's already been for discussion in October, it could progress. And now I think we can say with assurance, this board was already hearing things and being engaged and informed, but now they've had a chance, you all as a board seated, have had a chance to answer questions. So depending on where the comfort of the board is where to schedule that. So does it go in for discussion later in the month? Does it go for action later in the month? Is there another called meeting specifically for that need earlier in the month? So it really is going to depend on the route in which you all choose to go, Ms. Hammond.
And the 25th is the only scheduled board meeting left in this month.
Right.
Well, how about some ideas from you guys? Do you feel like we have come to some type of consensus, even though this is not anywhere we're voting on anything, but as chairman, when we look at the agenda, would you like it to be on action? Do you feel like, do you presenters feel like you could send something back to us before our meeting that we could entertain the ideas we've put, or you put together from our questions and answers, and something we could vote on? Is it doable?
Mr. Gallagher?
Mr. Gallagher, yeah, I'm really kind of asking you guys, could you have the time to get it back to us to see it in our packet? We would get it, on that Thursday before we meet on, well, sometimes we get it earlier, don't, because it's online.
Ms. Hammond, may I ask a question for clarification, because that may help with planning. Looking on slide 11, that last bullet, you see that we've had approximately 3,000 page views over the last 3 months. I heard Mr. Lovelace and Ms. Gardner and others ask about the interactive map. If the board is discussing the idea of updating the interactive map and then taking feedback from that, we, of course, have been receiving questions through our redistricting at lexrich5.org. Is that right, Dr. Harris? I'm thinking from memory, and I'm drawing a little delay with that. So we would need clarification. Are you looking for feedback from the public via the questions being submitted for the FAQ? Are you looking for feedback with the virtual maps, or is the feedback based upon this conversation to have it ready? Because if we're looking for a window of time for feedback, it concerns me, are we going to have time when you see that number over 3 months, knowing what the date is today, giving this team time to be prepared to make revisions and post, and we've not communicated to the community to look for a date of a next time. We have done a lunch and learn. We've done an evening virtual session and have drawn, I think, a significant size of crowd and answered those questions. And then, of course, the FAQ has gained momentum with lots of interest with people viewing. But there's a lot of variables being discussed. I just want to make sure that the work of the team is in alignment with the expectations of the board.
Well, Dr. Melton, if we, you feel like we've met the qualifications or the part of our job to present to the public, and they have their opportunity to weigh in on those meetings they've had? Or do you think if we have something new, these 2 new ones we saw tonight, they really haven't been seen by the public?
No, ma'am, the new things
So-
have, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, is there any way we could have them on our, on our upcoming meeting to be, they would be discussed for the first time, not the whole scenarios that we had seen twice, but if we had that could we be ready to share it with the interactive map, and then the meeting in February, we have a vote? Would that hurt your timeline to get the things you need to be rolling, especially to know whether it's a fifth grade or it's
So,
what?
so let's look ahead to
Yeah.
February. Thank you, Ms. Garris. The next regularly scheduled board meeting is February the 22nd, which is the last Monday because,
See, I
of
think that's
course,
too late.
That's too late. Let me ask you this. If you, because we vote on when our meetings are, and they're already there, if we can, when we are together at the next meeting, can we vote to add a meeting in February? Or is that something, not a special call, but make it a regular Monday night meeting, but we schedule it? Is that, I didn't know if we can do that. Mr. White, can we do that? Reason I'm asking you,
Can it just be a special called meeting?
you will know that. You've been on here the longest.
Ms. Hammond, and I'm not a parliamentarian,
I don't
but
know.
you can certainly have a special call meeting. We've done that.
Yeah.
And I'll use the example of summers. Whenever we've had a disruption in the meetings of the board in the summer, there have been times that the board has convened in the morning so that we could make sure that personnel was taken. So there's been that special call meeting. We've also had, if you think back when the bids went out for our auditing companies, we had a special call meeting, one item agenda for that, where the board came in of those members that were available and had more than a quorum, where there were presentations by auditing firms. So if you all could do that, of course, have a special call meeting and that become the agenda item. So I would not encourage you to wait till this 22nd of February, because that is so late for us. But
agree.
I am very sensitive to the fact that I celebrate our community engagement, but our community has not had a chance to, obviously, tuning in tonight. I don't know how many are listening in. The video will be posted. People can watch that. I think that we have offered additional meetings, which I failed to say earlier. Ms. Goggins and I have met with some of the communities that had a lot of emails to the board so that we could answer questions of them, of those communities, and had favorable responses of that. But I don't know with confidence that we would have the preparation if we tried to accelerate this towards a January meeting, if you're, the 25th meeting, if you're looking for a certain level of engagement.
Thank you. And that's what I feel strongly about that. And if it's workable for you that we have a meeting, that we do call for that one item and have it in the early February, that way we would have time to have it before the public. I mean, that's how I feel. But now I'm just one. Mr. Lovelace, how do you
Well,
feel?
I just wondered, I was looking ahead at what we have to get done and the number of meetings we got and that we've got scheduled. And I was wondering if we could come to a meeting of the minds and maybe review that calendar and put not just that meeting, but several more regular meetings back on the calendar. Because
That was my question.
yeah, that-
Once you voted on it, I didn't know if we could redo the calendar.
Well, that was changed by the former board. It used to be 22 meetings, I think, and then they changed it to some lesser amount, and then again to 16, I think. So I was just wondering, if everybody, thought, and I know we can't talk about it,
Tonight,
but put that in your mind, into your train of thought vis-a-vis this situation we got right here, and have some feedback on that. So.
If the board, if no one just objects or give me your opinion, that's, in our workshop, we're getting opinions. If Dr. Melton feels that it is workable for her, if we have a meeting by, not having this ready for January 25th, but we could have a meeting before the February meeting, and that would be where we could vote on it, because it would give the month, the rest of January for you guys to get back to us. And I like the idea of the interactive map. And I think that would be doable. I mean, that's what I'm looking at. What do you think, Ms. Huddle? That looks all right? Ms. Hines, anybody have another?
I guess my question is how long does it take to get this plan? So like, I mean, if they can turn this plan around where they have it on Friday and they can either next week or the week after, we have another workshop and talk about it and put it out on our website, and we have our meeting on January 25th, and between now and then, we kind of gauge public input. And, I mean, the map really isn't that much. Now, the plans that they presented today, I think we just kind of chopped up a little bit. So I don't really want anybody, it's not, okay, let me rephrase. It's not that I don't want people to look at it. I don't want people to think that that's what we're voting on. So that we're looking for those two new suggestions. But we're talking about meeting dates and feasibility for us. I just need to know what their process is. Like, when they've heard what we had to say today, when can they have it ready to present to us? And then what's that turnaround of us turning it to the public?
I got you. That's a great question.
Ms. Hammond, may I ask for a little bit of clarification? I'm looking at the last motion, and that's been referenced, of course, in the presentation. And the motion that passed with majority vote, and I don't remember that vote, and of course, Ms. Strange isn't here with the record. The board requested one additional scenario that addressed creating an attendance zone for Piney Woods Elementary, so that there'd be a total of 2 scenarios for the board to take action on whenever it came time for that. We've had several ideas this evening, all of consideration. Are we, for the success of Mr. Zuba, Mr. Gallagher, are you all saying to us to create those 2 scenarios, one additional, because we already had one, and then one additional for Piney Woods, but we've still got out there for discussion the idea of 5th grade or not, because the administration, in cooperation with our team, could create 2 scenarios that come back that still don't have the support. And I'm not polling, I'm not suggesting that, but time is ticking, and I'm just curious, Mr. Zuba, Mr. Gallagher, I don't know that you have clarity as to what kind of scenarios to put out. We've had 4 scenarios out with interactive maps. So I don't know how much time it would take you to reset, and if you have clarity as to what those 2 scenarios may be. So I'm going to look to the 2 of you to see if you could weigh in to give me some feedback.
Sure, I'll get started, and Pat, you feel free to chime in. So I think what we heard so far, we've gotten a lot of good input just based on the flow of natural traffic and some pinch points of some suggestions based on what we've shown for those planning block changes. And Pat and I have just been going back and forth while you've been in discussion, and a quick back of the napkin based on some of the suggested changes. We're looking at a roughly K4 enrollment for about 400 students for K4. So I think that could be a good starting point. So we're pretty clear on what some of those suggestions are for one scenario. The question we have, which could help getting some clarification on, is should the scenario 2 still involve those same geographic areas, but have a play on the K5 versus the K4, or has the board made a decision to move past having a K5 and made a decision on a K4? Pat, did that sum it up?
Yeah.
What you're hearing?
Yeah,
Okay.
so it kind of, I think, aligns with Mr. Lovelace's idea of moving the kind of the 16 student area back into Chapin, and then looking at that northern end of Lake Murray.
Yeah.
And sending that either to Lake Murray or Chapin, and keeping kind of the blocks that are kind of south and west of Chapin Center in Piney Woods.
And Pat, just because I know time is of the essence to be able to get this implementation moving, can you open up the map so everybody could see, and then we could kind of highlight those blocks just so we can get concurrence on we are all talking about the exact same blocks here. And do you have a version that doesn't flash?
All right, let me go into PowerPoint mode. That'll solve it.
Having a seizure.
It'll be easier on the eyes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know if it was me or if everybody else was seeing it as well.
Great. Can everybody see?
Yeah.
All right, so I have, and this I think aligns with Mr. Lovelace's idea from earlier. This pink would be the blocks for Piney Woods. Here's Chapin Center here, here's Amex Ferry Road. This area would stay in Chapin. We'd have, I think, a similar Chapin to the one presented in the third option, or the third idea tonight, and then we'd keep this northern end either in Lake Murray or we'd split it somehow. These two schools would be, at least with these numbers, that doesn't account for any students who opt out through open choice or magnets. Lake Murray is a little pretty close to the target enrollment, so that may be one where we may have to just adjust some of the boundaries to shift a few more into Chapin. But all in all, I think this is definitely one that could work.
And one of the things that would take a little bit of a deeper dive for us is, as part of this, we would then look at some development potential and be able to make some moves there to help sort of future-proof it against growth. And of course, one of the things we'll want to do is go through our process of running projections on it to make sure it tests out over the long term. So if we can get confirmation that this is in fact sort of the geographic thinking for at least one of the scenarios, that would be great.
All right. Yeah, let me I want to be sure, Dr. Melton, that we are meeting your expectations of a timeline.
Well, I think, Ms. Hammond, if I were to summarize this conversation, I think we have heard the interest of the board to do some adjustments for traffic flow.
Yes.
I think we have heard interest in the board to do a PK through 4 depending. And I think we have heard from the board in your discussion to get out as quickly as possible some virtual interaction so that our community can have a chance to preview. And when we bring it back to the board for action, if the board needs further discussion, then the board can choose not to take action. If the board decides that they want to include 5th grade, the board can take action to include 5th grade. If the board would like to revise a scenario that may be of interest of the two, the board could then adjust that. So if I were to summarize, I think that gives us enough tactical stuff to get started, enough tactical information, not stuff, enough tactical information to get started. So let me ask Mr. Zuba, Mr. Gallagher, how much time might you need approximately, knowing that it is after 6 o'clock our time zone, on a Wednesday evening, how much time might you need so that we could start tomorrow, and before the end of the week, we could start communicating our messaging to the community to be on the lookout for an update in our resources so that families can go in and look and have a chance to manipulate and insert to see how the scenarios then affect them and their households?
Okay. And I think in looking at this scenario and looking at what we need to do, I would feel pretty comfortable if we were to let the public know that, say, by Thursday or so of next week, Friday, they can start looking for that scenario viewer to see the additional information out there. That would allow us the end of this week as well as the beginning of next week to do our necessary due diligence that we need to ensure that everything's going to be sound, have a vetting with the administration, and then be able to start getting it out there in the public if that works. I think that would probably be the most aggressive schedule that that I would feel comfortable with.
That would be January 15th on that Friday, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And we would have the meeting, yeah. To me, that's good. I mean, I'm happy with that, but that's just me. Everybody okay?
Is,
And then I like how
when's the next meeting?
Sir?
25th or
Ms.
28th?
Hammond, when's the next meeting?
The next scheduled meeting is the 25th. So that's 10 days. And that way, what we're trying to be sure we do is give them time to come back with this, but also share interactive map with the community.
So, Ms. Hammond, what if we were to say, and of course, the week of the 18th is Martin Luther King holiday on Monday the 18th. So if we were to have Friday, January the 15th as our date for rollout, as Mr. Lovelace says, of next phase of information, then we could have it available for access the week of the 18th. It goes out Friday the 15th. When board packet comes out to the board on the 21st, you would not have a summary because it would still be going on, and the team would need time to take it down to review that information, but we could give slides with holders to give you the heading of what would be there. That way we could deactivate it or timestamp some information so that when the presentation is given on Monday night, the 25th, you would have already known the header of information that's coming, and we'll try to get that update to the board as quickly as possible. But I just want to have full disclosure. When the board receives the board packet on the 21st, it would not have complete information because that operational window is still active, because I don't want to put families in a short window with the 18th being a holiday, giving them only the 19th and the 20th, of course, weekends. It depends on of time of access. But if we could have it open that full week of the 18th, then we could have the weekend and that Monday to get prepared to give you an overview as to what we know as far as feedback at that point. Mr. Zuba, Mr. Gallagher, is that something that we could produce?
I see a nod, yes.
Is that acceptable, Ms. Hammond?
Yes, I mean, I feel good about that. Thank you. We worked that out.
Ms. Hammond,
Yes.
if I can ask, or just another observation and a question, but it seems like, you know, to me, just an observation, you know, maybe it's put on the agenda for the 25th and it can be tabled if people aren't comfortable, you know, if there's more feedback that's needed. And then we just have a special called meeting the first week in February to finalize it. My personal opinion is there's, you know, you want community input, but in the final analysis, these roadway issues need to be something the board needs to make a final decision on. And I think that what we've sort of landed on is designed to try to minimize the movement and minimize the traffic. And I think that probably is an aspect we need to default to and make that decision. And some of y'all live in Chapin and are more familiar with the roadways than me, but I think that would give us time. If we're ready to make a decision, make it on the 25th. If we're not, then we sort of have a tentative time set, whether it's an early morning meeting or whatever, with a one agenda item and wrap it up the first week in February.
Thank you, Mr. White. I wanted to say, too, give credit, Dr. Milton showed me the map that I had brought, and I had talked with Mr. White about how it was such a good example done a few years back and under Dr. Hefner, and I still had it on the, it's still on the email. But this group has already had this information that was provided by Dr. Milton's staff. So that makes me feel good, because I just always feel like it's continuity of how it looked then, and now we're in 2021, and it's still, you know, something that we can use from work we did previously. So I thank you, Dr. Milton, that I really didn't need to bring you that. You already had it.
We appreciate that you are protective of us, Ms. Hammond.
Thank you. Is there, okay, so I think do I have any questions, though, about our plan or our workshop? Ms. Huddle?
I know we're not allowed to vote, so I don't know how to communicate this, but
No,
I
ma'am,
mean,
we can't.
obviously, we're moving toward a Piney Woods only solution at this time.
Yes, as a priority. I think, well, this has closing comments, Ms. Huddle.
Oh, can I make a closing comment?
Yes,
to say that?
I have
Okay.
one, too.
And I want to add one other thing, just, the school choice is, the schools are certainly up to Dr. Melton who to include in that, but I am getting phone calls and concerns of people that are zoned for Chapin and Irmo Elementary, that those two schools are on there. So I just thought I'd share that as a closing comment.
That their school of choice.
That they're on there and that they are worried that the school is getting too big, you know, or their classrooms are getting too large. So I just wanted to pass that along, because I've had multiple parents from both those schools contact me.
Chapin Elementary?
Irmo Elementary, I'm sorry, Chapin High School and Irmo Elementary.
Elementary, gotcha, because they're both school choices right now.
Yeah.
Did you want to comment to that, Dr. Milton?
Yes, ma'am, both if you don't mind. Ms.
Sure.
Huddle was very sensitive to make sure there wasn't discussion of voting. And just for the clarity, as the staff would hear me say, although the board has not approved minutes, the last motion of which the board did support 7-0, we are working towards the motion that was passed at the last meeting focused upon Piney Woods Elementary. So that will be a short-term plan. And Ms. Hammond and I have discussed, Piney Woods, of course, is in need immediately of the administration, and then the board would then decide when to revisit other needs that would be more system-wide and short-term versus long-term. So just to make sure that there was more context for those that may become alarmed, that may have questions based upon what Ms. Huddle just shared. And then Ms. Hammond, regarding school choice, as an administration, we've been waiting to find out this information before we have made any stark changes to anything else, because one affects another. We, of course, have policies that relate to choice. So those students that have chosen to be at a school of choice, per policy, they are allowed to finish the highest grade of completion, whether that's elementary, middle, or high. And so if we're going to look at any revisions with board policy, we'd have to make sure that we brought that back to the board for consideration of those that are currently there, if we're going to be removing them. Of course, we're going to manage the number of seats, so although the schools may be open, Dr. Harris, with Accountability and Human Resources, we limit the number of seats available based upon the current staffing there. So we control short-term and long-term. And we're, of course, working towards the will of the board, seeing the vision that you have. So because the immediate focus is Piney Woods and not the rest of the district, then we would manage appropriately towards those numbers to make sure that we are properly staffing and properly allowing school of choice for the appropriate number of seats available in those places. That may be more complicated than needed, but hopefully that helps with a little bit of context.
Thank you. My closing comments, pretty much what you just said. We still have before us the entire redistricting plan. So I want the public to know that that's not we're not kicking that down the road, but we see with the COVID crisis we're dealing with, we also know that immediately we need Piney Woods, and that is, as Dr. Milton told me, it was very easy. We can take a part of that and make a vote on that and get that moving as we're planning. But it doesn't mean that we have taken anywhere off the table, the big picture. But that will be forthcoming, so no one needs to worry right at this point, because I know that redistricting always brings tension to parents. So with that being said, I'm about to hit this gavel unless anybody else has something to say. But I want to thank the board and the staff for a special workshop that really I feel was needed and helped us all. And thank you for the presenters. We appreciate your hard work, and thank you for working within our timeline, because this is very important to get this school moving. Thank you. I don't have to do any of that. We're done. No votes.
No votes.